Elizabeth, thank you for joining us on 10 Across Conversations.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. As I often say, but in particular with regard to this conversation, I have really been looking forward to this. We're talking about your book, and it's a really good listen because you are the narrator, so I can't recommend it enough to our audience. But let's dive into this by first understanding your professional role as a writer, that leads to some degree into this book.
Yeah, so my sort of first gig out of college, I went to Vassar College where I was an insufferable English major and just kind of wanted to do that professionally for the rest of my life. And so I started off an editorial assistant at Vanity Fair, where essentially it was like part Devil Wears Prada running around the streets of New York, getting coffee and boogie boards. And the other half that was really kind of cutting my teeth was helping the roster of Vanity Fair writers do the bulk of their research before and during their research trips. So that was sort of how I learned by watching writers and photographers and artists kind of how they start from ground zero and start building up their articles via research. From there, I went to the Huffington Post, where I was a news editor that started off running the front page and then eventually was working kind of half days, half nights on the front page and what was then called the blog role, and eventually segued into being a writer and editor for what was then called their living page, which was kind of like, the importance of naps and writing articles about the good work that yogurt companies were doing. So it was a very much like learning how to write about anything on a very short amount of time. And that was kind of like my Lois Lane era of not running around, but the mouse moved around a lot because it was online journalism. And then from there, I was functioning mostly as a creative writer, doing ghostwriting speeches, writing jokes for comedians, doing punch-up works on scripts that already existed but needed better jokes, and eventually and freelancing kind of culture reporting for The Guardian and The New York Times and Time Magazine and VanityFair.com. So I was kind of a Jane of all mediums. If it required the written word and it paid, I showed up at any time. So my reporting bona fides have never been rock solid. My observing bona fides have always been, since I was a young judgmental child, have been, that's really what I've honed.
So let's talk about the article that you pitched and what you wanted to write, which could not be more solidly within the 10 Across concept that we have developed here.
Yeah, it's eerily similar. If only I'd known you guys existed.
Yeah, and there were four aspects that you wanted to get to in that article around things that we talk about frequently and have had many podcasts with people speaking directly to the issues of immigration, climate change, infrastructure, the role of democracy in the largest states, and that includes voter suppression and things like that. Yeah. So a very 10 Across table of contents that was to be the article you wanted to write.
Yeah.
But you have a really great quote here. And for those who are listening, I'm giving away a little bit of the story, but your editor said, no magazine editor wanted Tom Hanks' daughter to write that story, probably because it didn't look like what you had previously been writing about. And what you wound up with was a book that really is about, yes, your keen observations, which you've already said you've strengthened over the years, as well as a discussion about really finding your mother in a certain way. So you wrote a book that has two components. Talk about what you want to write about and what you did write about.
Right. There was this time in my life where I had been sort of blessed with an incredible opportunity with a book deal and immediately choked and was not able to deliver on that, and had sort of as blocks work kind of it was sort of metastasizing, and I wasn't able to finish that book, and then soon enough I was not able to finish anything. And part of the sort of creative recovery was all of the things I just mentioned, writing speeches for people, ghost writing jokes, et cetera, et cetera. And as I sort of pulled myself out of creative block, I started realizing that I had inadvertently, and by doing my sort of Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours, except this was 10,000 pages, I realized that I had built up a muscle and then I was in a position to do something that mattered, that would have my name on it, that had my perspective of it. It wasn't something I was writing for someone else. It wasn't a script that I wasn't particularly emotionally involved in. I wanted to do something with some skin in the game, as it were. And this is around 2012, 2016. And I realized that I had been cutting out, because I'm very old school, very analog medium. I had been cutting out all of these newspaper articles about things and stories that had been catching my eye. And when I kind of laid them all out on the floor, I realized that they were all kind of four, as I called them, political theaters, which was immigration, infrastructure, climate change, and the role of democracy, and the way that voter suppression was playing a role in the erosion of democracy. And I realized that kind of at the same time that all of these things were evident on the path of a road trip I had taken with my mother in 1996 across Interstate 10 from California to Florida, and that actually that there was a complete through line through these issues, and that perhaps there was a story to be written about those things that was sort of in journalism, we say pegged to not a news event that was coming up, but it pegged to this interstate and this artery through the American landscape. So I started pitching an article, and I pitched this article for, I want to say 3 or 4 years, where essentially I was going to all the magazine editors that I knew, and I said, listen, I know that you know me as someone who writes about television or film, or that I've written jokes for you, but I really want to do something more sizable. This is what I want to write. And everybody's response was like, geez, do you want to add racism to the list? Or how can you bite off more than you can already not chew? And also, you are not a political reporter. You are not a travel reporter. You're not really a reporter at all. You have witticisms about television that garner good click rates. You are not David Remnick going to witness the collapse of the Soviet Union. Maybe you want to right size your ambition. And fair enough. None of that is incorrect. That is all factually accurate. But I knew that that I had noticed a pattern, and I could not help that. In murder television shows where they're trying to figure out who the murderer is, and they get a map and they start pinning where all the different murderers are, and they're like, "Oh, I bet you the murderer lives somewhere in the middle of all of these pins." I had been pinning sort of mentally where all of these kind of cataclysmic events, or cataclysmic as I defined it, all of these events were happening along this artery of Interstate 10. And I thought maybe that's the hook that is sort of missing from this pitch is, oh, it's the 10, which I know because I've driven it before. And maybe the aspect that is sort of missing from this is that I need to get in a car and do the 10 again. And so this is going to be a travel road story. And that certainly helped the sort of pitch, but was not quite enough to push me over the edge and successfully sell the story. So for 3 years, it was a failed article.
You said something that's really interesting, because when we started the 10 Across project, we had a large wall that looked like one of those made for television crime
Conspiracy
scene
wall.
pin-up things.
Lots of red thread.
With strings. Yes, literally. It was fuchsia thread that connected all these issues for us. And people would walk into our office and say, what the heck?
Yeah.
It showed the 10 running across the wall about 20 feet and all the things that we were doing, just like you were, and saying, what is it about this region of the country, its geography, the different orientation of certain states and their government, the kind of things that go on here, the industries are here, the designs of cities, landscapes, etc. And so, like you, we found this area particularly compelling. And I want to get to your observations as we move a little bit west to east across the 10, as you did in the next part of our discussion here. But I just want to add one last thing to the first part. What is it, and I think many people have had this observation, both personally and other writers have, what is it about a road trip and a solitary road trip to some degree, meeting with others, that is a great way to search not only for yourself, but who you are, your history, whether it's family history or other things. What's in your case, the observation about the connection between travel and self-awareness, self-observation, greater understanding?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when, the thing that kind of kicked the article from being a failed article and then into a failed podcast and then into a book, the thing that, meant that I finally got permission to do the project, because that's what all artists are seeking at some point, is permission to do the work. Once I had stumbled onto this family mystery and I had a personal sort of whodunit that involved myself and my family, that's when sort of the surfboard took off on the wave and the project got greenlit and I was able to do it. And now there's the book. And I think part of the success of the pitch for the book was the understanding that the road trip is really the contemporary hero's journey. We do not often, in contemporary life, swear off worldly goods and set off in sackcloth and ashes and barefooted to travel up the mountain to speak to a hermit to find out what it's really all about. Maybe things would be going a little better if we still did that, although I'd be dubious about the hermit on the mountain. And I don't like being barefoot. But I think, when we're talking about the real meat of life, the really red letter moments that kind of define what the human experience is, I always think of Joseph Campbell and his conversation about the hero's journey. And when things really matter, you see them in the fairy tales, you see them in the myths, you see them in the great epics. And the journey that presents the hero with a series of obstacles that reflect their own hubris is present in every major human civilization. The journey that reflects the outer journey that reflects the inner struggle and the inner search there's a reason why it is so present in every major and I guess non-major sort of storytelling practice. It's because it's a very apt metaphor for the sort of emotional cave spelunking that we do when we are invested in significant emotional processes as we try to understand who we are, where we come from, and what is this whole being alive thing. And I think in America, there's a moment in my book when I describe a dear Scottish friend. I send him a picture of the great American 2-lane highway going through the monodocks of the Southwest, and his response is, "That's it. That's the American highway. That's the Bruce Springsteen song. That's the Faulkner novel." I think the journey. I think Americans don't understand how big America is. It's gigantic. And the journey across the land is part of our American myth. It's there in Bruce Springsteen, which is kind of he's our modern kind of Aesop with his fables. And so I think that's part of it. Yeah.
I think we both arrived at the same conclusion. It wouldn't be the same going across, if you will, the northern part of the country and hitting major cities that we know immediately by their silhouettes. San Francisco, Chicago, New York. The 10 offers those moments of of, some might say, banality on that 2-lane road, that picture that you took. And the things in between are still not well defined. You have to think hard. What am I looking at here? The 10 is still available as a quintessentially American landscape. And by the way, a lot of it is pretty unsightly, the things that we have built. You talk about sprawl, you talk about the redundancy of the fast food restaurants and other things. There's something about the 10 that tells us who we are as a country at this moment, which I don't think other roads do. Before we go on, and my producer's probably thinking, this is going to have to be a 2-part episode because we really haven't even gotten to the meat of what we want to talk about. And I don't want to harp on this too much. You had some diaries that your mother left, which prompted you to take this trip, and you interwove your observations in your book with the places where you were and what she was writing about. So there's that component of this. Her storytelling to some degree, and poems and other things. And there's no denying that spending time on film sets with your father caused you to think about storytelling and these journeys, which often are depicted in his films. So you grew up in, if you will, a storytelling environment. Talk about how that helped you to be sure that, this is something that one does.
I think one of the great privileges, and I'm swaddled in them, of growing up in a family of artists is that there's never a conversation that it's a real career path. I think if you grow up in a family of speech pathologists or industrial carpet installation firms or dentists, and you decide that you want to go write music in Nashville, you kind of have to convince everyone around you that that's a real thing that you can do. It's not necessarily a straight career path, but people have done it, and hopefully you get to do it too. When you grow up in a family of working artists, very successful working artists, there's no conversation about this is a real thing because you grow up in the dream factory. Right. The plus point of that is that it's very empowering that you don't have to convince someone that art is important. The downside of that is that, your proverbial work goes on the refrigerator until you're around 12 or 13. And then you get notes, then there begets the question, but is my art good? Right. That's a whole separate conundrum that maybe if your parents are dentists, they don't really have any opinion if your art is good or not. But certainly I grew up in that environs, and I think feeling empowered to tell stories and feeling empowered to find my medium, not through acting, not through editing. I have a brother who's a cameraman. Like, we all have found our mediums in which we feel empowered to tell our stories our way. And I think obviously most people are aware of my dad's career and my stepmother's career and my older brother's career and my younger brother's career. Most people don't even know my mother exists. And if you Google, Tom Hanks' first wife, they don't have the right name. And it's been really interesting, actually, how often, my mother's name is in the book. And it's been fascinating how many reviews and articles in the wake of the book being published still get her name wrong. Which is she would find interesting. But so not only was it important to me that I introduce my mother to the world, but that I introduce her as an artist as well. An artist who was never published, an artist who was never trained, but getting to engage with her poetry and to edit it myself, and the decision to put it in the book was a way of me taking ownership of her own artistic legacy, and I think sort of insisting that it be taken seriously. And I think the book is really about, in some degrees, the nightmare of my mother's existence, the fantasy of my father's existence and me trying to ground myself in the American reality that is so evident on the 10.
So I can imagine our listeners, having heard that last sentence, will say, what is she talking about? And that's why I would recommend, and I think it's okay, I recommend that you read the book or listen to the book. Elizabeth's mother had some challenges. I'm just going to put it that way.
Yes.
And obviously they had a complex relationship. Everybody knows your father's career, and you're trying to sort it out, reconcile some things by hitting the road and having the geography that you traveled with your mother, the road that you traveled, where things were laid out and experiences were had, again, some 25 or so years later, to try to understand what that was all about. And I think, as you said at the beginning, you've honed your skills as an observer, which lend themselves to the book for those who really want to think about what 10 Across is founded on. Why does this landscape look the way it does? What were the decisions that were made? And are we aware of what we're building? And once you build a lot of things that we have done, you own it. You sort of now have to address that. And that sounds like what you wanted to write about. So let's start with something that really gets into the landscape.
Yeah.
You mentioned that as you drive through places like where I am now, Phoenix and other places, you say in the Southwest, it feels like everything I see is on borrowed time. Golf courses, the green lawns, because you're aware of what we're dealing with, the Colorado River, which impacts where you frequently are in Los Angeles or here in Phoenix or elsewhere. I totally agree with that. We look at the man-made overlay on the landscape and it looks provisional. Tell us more about that observation, what it meant to you.
Well, I was born in Southern California. I was raised in Northern California, two landscapes that do not enjoy each other. And if you were to ask anyone from Ronald Reagan to Joan Didion to anybody I went to middle school with, what is part of the North-South California divide, they would say water. When you are from California, you drive the 5, as I have done hundreds and hundreds of times, I cannot remember a time when the 5 did not include signs that said Congress made Dust Bowl. Because the conversation about the allocation of water, not only our natural water table sources, but the Colorado River and all of the places that California, really Los Angeles, takes water from, is such an integral part of the sort of civic existence that you have as a Californian. So I'm already primed to notice drought. I'm already primed to notice scarcity in the water. My partner and I are in a very conflicted conversation about California because we really have no interest in participating in the water wars of 20 whenever.
Right.
And so when I came to Phoenix, which I had not spent really any time in before 2019, when I moved into the van to do this project, I was seeing it with completely the naked eye, right? I'm coming in with my California experience, but I have no idea kind of what I'm in for. And what I realized very quickly driving around Phoenix is that no decision I'm seeing in the physical landscape seems responsible or has an evident ideology that is built into the lived experience of the city. Actually, it feels antagonistic to the human experience of living in the city. Phoenix is the first place where I write about stroads, these roads that are so big that they're streets, they're roads. It's a surface level street that is has as many lanes as a highway.
Right.
They're 6 lanes wide, which means that people are driving in a surface street up to 55 to 65 miles per hour, which you cannot, like, do you want to see what happens to a human body when it's hit by a piece of metal tonnage at 65 miles per hour? Nothing good. So you can't have pedestrians by stroads. And if you can't have pedestrians, there's no foot traffic. So there has to be car traffic. And if you're depending on car traffic, you you have to have a huge parking lot so that everyone can pay. And if you have a huge parking lot, the store has to be back from the street. So how do you signal that? You have to build a sign that's on a huge scale so that everyone driving at 70 miles per hour on a surface level street can see where the big box store is. Just the trickle on, to say nothing of, there's no shade. There's no green grass. This is just asphalt that is absorbing and keeping this heat all day long. So Phoenix was really the first landscape where I thought, well, this is so antagonistic to the physical realities of the heat, of the water, of what people need to flourish in this landscape. It doesn't seem sustainable. And what isn't sustainable is on borrowed time. And I just noticed that every time I would ask someone, hey, what is what's your feeling about how long this is all going to go on? Everyone looked at me like I was absolutely nuts until I interviewed Dan Flores. Dan Flores is a writer who is a sociologist, and he kind of had a crossover hit with this book, Coyote America, or American Coyote, I can't remember. And when I said to him, how long is this going to go on? He immediately said, no, 30, maybe 35 more years, like without blinking. He was knew exactly what I was referencing.
Right.
And it was my first awareness that not only are we a little off the mark, we're way off the mark. That if you were actually building things according to the resources that we have, the physical landscape would be almost unrecognizable.
Right.
Starting with Strodes, but moving all the way into residences, and to say nothing of like golf courses and blah, 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 all of that.
I think what you are saying will be not jarring to some people who are really trying in the fifth largest city in the United States to create some walkable communities. We're now having things built with no cars. The mayors with whom I work here are trying to create downtowns which are following, if you will, sort of a 15-minute city kind of rule, trying to be more compact. But I want them to hear through this interview that for a keen observer like yourself who has no stake in it, you're not a developer here who's trying to do some good work. Let's assume that's the case. This is what you see and the messages it sends to you, which are equally legitimate. And trying to reconcile those two things is what Phoenix is all about. And I think asking people, and you would get a similar answers from others, not just Dan, how much water do we have? If the Colorado went dry tomorrow, the people who know how much groundwater we have and others would say, I don't know, 20 years. Well, that's not how civilizations are built in 20-year, 35-year increments. We're remarkably resilient, all of us in society. And I think there's an imagination that goes along with this, that we will invent our way further along out of this situation. And there are a lot of people who are quite hopeful about that and absolutely committed to it. But I think your observations are fair at a much higher level as you look down on what we've built.
I think it's, there's, I read constant, well, I read all the time because that's really
that's pretty clear.
I think any writer would tell you that their real job is actually reading. A very good piece of advice I got very early on when I was still in high school was that you need to read more than you write, and you need to write all the time. So you basically need to constantly be reading. What I lack in reporting skills, I compensate with by being just a nerd. Excuse the F-bomb. But
we'll see if Taylor will probably
we can bleep me. Maybe I'll be the first bleeped 10x interview. But I was reading before I left. I was reading while I was on the trip. I was reading afterwards, and I was trying to stuff information and really data into the book up until the very last draft. Right. And it was infuriating because, I would turn in a draft and I would read something like, oh God, that I've got to can we literally stop the presses? And one of the pieces that I missed and could not get into the book, which I was kind of devastated, was this article that I read in the LA Times, I want to say, that was about a housing development that was built outside of Phoenix, that everyone just kind of assumed it would have water, that it would get access to the municipal system that, pulls from the Colorado. And whoops, no, it doesn't. They've
Right.
built this whole, track home development. I'm sure it's very nice. I'm sure it would be a lovely place to raise your children if you have air conditioning. And you go to turn on the taps and nothing comes out. And I thought that is a material reality that Americans are not prepared to deal with. That is a second to third world country issue that we have not wrapped our heads around is an actual possibility in this country. And I think the idea that a beautifully built new house, when you turn on the taps, it does not have water coming out is a reality that a lot of people are not prepared to engage with.
There's a little more to that story.
Of course, yes.
It was not, I know what you're referring to,
Right.
and it was not, but it caught a lot of attention, and it was the New York Times story, LA Times
thank
story,
you, yeah.
because I think many people say, what the heck are you doing out in the desert? Looks pretty hostile. We know it's dry. It's getting
Well, it's
hotter.
hostile to the way we live. Yeah.
And so I think when a story comes along that has some substance to it that confirms people's belief, it's sort of jumped on. In fact, those were people who built some houses on available lots, sort of a little more on their own because they like the desert.
Right.
It wasn't planned out, and therefore their assumptions about how they would get water from an adjacent municipality would go on forever. But now that municipality was saying, we barely have enough for what we're planning appropriately. Right. Having outlying people saying, yeah, but can't we have some of that as well? Probably couldn't go on in perpetuity. So, but the point is well made. The observations here suggest that we need to plan, build according to the environment in which we're located. And that was a case where clearly there was a disconnect. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, you just mentioned you're from California. Mm-hmm. You went through Texas. The southern tier of the U.S. is different, and there are various versions of the U.S., and that's the beauty, I think, of the I-10 and what it cuts through.
Yeah.
The California-Texas duality, both enormous in scale and scope.
Yeah.
But as you say, a Californian is uniquely unsuited to write about Texas, as we are two different expressions of the same idea, a republic within the republic. And that's why we laid out 10 across. Mm-hmm. We know there are these dualities or multivariant valent ways of looking at what democracy is. Your thoughts about the two largest states, knowing that Florida is lurking over here on the east side with its own idea about what America is. Talk about these different perceptions of America.
In the opening chapter of the book, I say that only people who are not from California would ever mistake Los Angeles and San Francisco as sister cities. That only really works if they're sisters who don't speak. I would say that California and Texas are in the same family, but they're the cousins that get in a brawl every cookout. Just every frickin' summer, someone's got to say something and it kicks off. I think a very dear friend of mine who is helping me write the book, he's a travel writer, Brandon Presser. Readers will recognize him from the Houston chapter. And I invited Brandon onto the trip because I wanted to watch him put an international eye onto an American city. If I was coming in sort of green, Brandon is coming in fluorescent green in terms of he's really coming in with incredible experience of travel, but no immediate experience of the landscape. And the conversations we had about Texas and Houston did not help me when I was writing the Texas chapters. In fact, Houston was the most difficult chapter to write. And in trying to parse why that was with Brandon, he said, you're on all cylinders when you love a place, and you are on all cylinders when you hate a place. And both of those are in the book. It's pretty obvious which ones they are. We'll get into it. But Houston and Texas in general befuddled me. And it felt like it was because I was in, when you're seeing mirror images of something where it's the same image, but in one image, the person's looking left, and in the mirror image, they're looking right. I think the Texas-California conundrum is that we consider ourselves to be the most America that America can get. We are some sort of embodiment. But when you look at the Central California myth and the Central Texan myth, they're the same myth. You can be whoever you want as long as you're willing to work hard. Life here is just better than anywhere else. We've got better food, we've got better landscapes. And yet, as I point out, there's a huge ranching system in California. And Texas has an incredible beach culture. They are living the salt life, as they say, on the Gulf. And so these huge dynamic states, which were republics that have their own relationship to our neighbors to the south, their history as being part of Mexico and the revolutions that they engaged in and the wars that they engaged in, that really create this self-determination of we wanted to be part of America. And that is why we are the most America. We volunteered for this mission, as opposed to just being kind of like grandfathered in by people who have buckles on their hats and their shoes. We fought to be part of this. I think means that Texas and California are they're kind of in a major key. They're that Whitney Houston, I want to dance with somebody, but when that key change kicks in, this isn't Delaware, this is Texas. It's a real kind of strident stand-in as a Californian. I feel exactly the same way as my state. So I was really fascinated by the way that California is blue and Texas is red, but have you been to Orange County? Have you been to Austin? It's like their nuances and the way that they double back and question even themselves are mirrored in some way. And I was really fascinated by that.
So I'm fascinated, and you're pretty clear. Your colleague has said, you struggle a little bit in certain places for a number of reasons. And I was very surprised at the minimal discussion of Houston. Your colleague said, I really want to go there because they don't have zoning. I want to see what that looks like. We've done many podcasts. Here's one I would recommend, Prophetic City, why Houston is the quintessential American city, looking at industry, looking at immigration. It's one of the most diverse cities in the country. And there was a lot more there.
And consequently, one of the most delicious cities in the country.
Yes,
I ate unbelievably well in Houston.
So there are a lot of the Houston landscape can give you all the negative feedback of America as you're driving through it. The 30-lane wide 10, nearly 30 lanes at a certain point, what it did to African-American communities as it bulldozed through that city. There are a lot of things to complain about, I suppose, in terms of Houston. But once you get to know it, an incredibly rich and uniquely complex American culture going on there. But you have to hang in there with it a little bit, and you're on a road trip. And just over the horizon, you can tell, as your friend probably noted, hey, wait a minute, there's New Orleans over there. The intimacy of an engagement with that city.
I feel badly for any city that is in the kind of like event horizon of New Orleans in immediate sort of infrastructure. You're just going to get sucked into an experience that is completely alien. I mean, Houston was hard because I ate some of the best food and I had some of the best conversations there, but it was always by happenstance. If I tried to get somewhere in Houston, I physically couldn't because of the built landscape and the traffic and all of that. And trust me, as an Angelino, I know how ridiculous it sounds for me to say it's too big and the traffic's too bad. I mean, that's something I try to point out in the book is how ironic this is. And I honestly think it's like, trying to imagine being a tourist in Los Angeles and going, I didn't really care for it. It's too big. I never got there. I kept driving around trying to get there and I couldn't get there. And yet that was the negaverse, the bizarre, the spy versus spy experience that I had in Houston. What was fascinating to me about Houston was that in the zoning laws, yes, the rings of freeways, and I call them freeways because in California they're free. I have no idea what I can't remember what they're called in Texas. And I remembered reading Lawrence Wright's book, God Save Texas, and his description of how culture is really built either from the ground up or from the bottom down, and that Texas really embodies the immigrant experience, which brings its cuisine, it brings its language, it brings its slang, and then the top-down culture that brings, finance, industry, charity, cultural institutions, and that Houston is this like big inconvenient melting pot within a melting. If Texas is a republic within a republic, Houston is the melting pot within the melting pot.
Absolutely, and sort of why the legislature in Austin has trouble with Houston, because it's moving towards where America is going.
Yeah.
And by the way, I mentioned this book, our podcast. It was with Stephen Kleinberg, who ran the Kinder Institute for Urban Research for many years. But it's just a great discussion of what you can learn about America by looking at Houston. I believe Houston is on course to replace Chicago as our third biggest. Yeah. Yes, it is. And obviously the energy capital of the world, quote unquote, and only becoming more so given certain things happening in DC.
Yeah.
But I just want to say this is why we picked the 10. Both of us. This is why we think this.
You never find the bottom. You never
sort of, kind
of. Yeah.
And we know how rich it is, and the distinctions between, let's say, Houston and New Orleans. And by the way, Ten Across would not exist without my 10 years experience of New Orleans and things having to do with what you knew was vulnerability, which is also Houston. Houston is as vulnerable,
wildly
and temporary
vulnerable.
as some of these other places.
Wildly vulnerable. Yeah. I think it's fascinating that everyone is kind of cognizant of how endangered New Orleans is, but Houston is. You cannot evacuate from there, and it's just as vulnerable with its sea level. And then its built landscape of all that concrete isn't doing anyone any favors either.
Well, there's that. And should the Houston Ship Channel experience a Katrina, the whole globe is going to feel it. And the pollution and everything that go with that